There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when the woman he has loved for 11 years looks him dead in the face and says, in front of their daughter, "I wish I had married someone who actually mattered." Desmond Calloway heard those words on a Wednesday evening in September, standing in the kitchen of their brownstone on Prospect Place in Brooklyn, still wearing the flour-dusted apron from the bakery, and he did not flinch. He set his keys on the counter. He looked at his wife. And something inside him, something that had been bending for a long time, did not break. It simply straightened. What Giselle Calloway did not know, what she had never once considered worth asking, was that the man she kept describing to her Manhattan colleagues as "my husband, the baker," had quietly built a financial architecture beneath her career so precise, so deliberate, that removing it would collapse everything she believed she had earned alone. Before we go any further, if you have ever poured yourself into someone who couldn't be bothered to notice, stay right here. This one is for you. The first thing people remembered about Desmond Calloway was his stillness, not shyness, not hesitation. The particular composure of a man who has already considered what you are about to say and decided it does not require reaction. He was 41, broad to the chest, with hands that carried the permanent warmth of a man who had been shaping dough since 4 in the morning. There was always a trace of cinnamon somewhere on him, in his collar, along the edge of his watch. His mother used to say he smelled like Sunday even on a Tuesday, and she had not been wrong. He ran Calloway and Sons on Atlantic Avenue, a bakery his father, Raymond Calloway, had opened in 1987 with a commercial mixer, a small business loan, and the quiet conviction that a man who feeds his neighborhood will never be poor in the ways that actually matter. Raymond had died 6 years ago. Heart attack. Quick, the doctor said, as though that were a comfort. He left behind the bakery, a paid-off building, and a handwritten letter in the bottom drawer of his desk that Desmond did not open for 3 months because he already knew, without reading it, that it would make him cry. The letter said, "Take care of what I started, and take care of the people around you, even the ones who don't see you yet, especially those ones." Desmond had honored that instruction with the seriousness of a man who understands that a promise to the dead is the only kind you cannot renegotiate. Giselle Thornton Calloway was the chief marketing officer of Lumen Capital, a private equity firm on Park Avenue whose offices occupied 3 floors of a building designed to remind you, the moment you stepped off the elevator, that you were probably not important enough to be there. She was brilliant at what she did. Strategic, precise. The kind of mind that could read a room the way a chess player reads a board, 4 moves ahead, already calculating the value of every piece. She had grown up in East New York, raised by a grandmother who cleaned offices in Midtown and told her, over and over, that the only way out was up and the only way out was through. Giselle had gone through. Full scholarship to NYU, MBA at Columbia. A career built with the relentless discipline of a woman who remembers what it feels like to count coins for the bus. She was not a bad person. She was a frightened one, and frightened people, over enough time, develop a particular talent for looking at the world through a single lens and mistaking it for the whole picture. Psychologists call this hypervigilance bias, when early deprivation conditions the brain to scan constantly for threats to status and security, even in the absence of actual danger. The scanning becomes so automatic that it reshapes perception itself. You stop seeing what is. You only see what might be taken away. For Giselle, Desmond had gradually become invisible. Not because he was small, but because he did not register on the scale she had built her life around. He did not network. He did not dress for influence. He woke at 3:45 every morning, drove to Atlantic Avenue in the dark, and made bread. He came home smelling like yeast and butter, and she had stopped finding that charming approximately 4 years ago. The Wednesday evening in September had been building for a long time. Giselle had come home late from a client dinner. Their daughter, Zara, 14, quiet and watchful in the way of children who have learned to read tension like weather, was sitting at the kitchen island doing homework. Desmond was plating leftover pasta. He had saved Giselle a portion, covered it, left a small note on top that said, "Ate without you. Yours is warm. D." The kind of gesture so ordinary it becomes invisible, which is precisely the point. Giselle walked in, glanced at the plate, and did not touch it. "The Whitfield Gala is Saturday," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "Victor is coming with me." Victor Ashford was 33, a senior associate at Lumen Capital, polished, performative, the kind of man whose confidence was engineered rather than earned. He wore watches that cost more than most people's cars, and spoke about himself in the third person when he'd had enough wine. He had been Giselle's protégé for 2 years, which was the word she used, and which Desmond had stopped believing approximately 6 months ago. Desmond looked at her. "I was planning to go." "Desmond." She said it the way you say the name of a problem you've already solved. "You'll show up in that sport coat you've had since 2016, shake hands with people who run hedge funds, and spend the entire night talking about sourdough starters. It's embarrassing for both of us." Zara's pencil stopped moving. "I'm taking Victor because he understands that world. He belongs there." She adjusted her earring in the hallway mirror. "You belong at the bakery. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't pretend it's the same thing." She walked upstairs. The stairs creaked on the fourth step, the way they always did, the way they had for 11 years. Zara looked at her father. Her eyes were wet, which she was trying very hard to hide. "Dad." "It's okay, sweetheart. It's not okay." He set down the spatula, walked around the island, put his hand on the top of her head, the way he'd done since she was small enough to fit entirely in the crook of his arm. "Some things," he said quietly, "take a little time to become clear." He kissed her forehead and went to the garage. What Giselle Thornton Calloway did not know could fill a building. It very nearly did. Raymond Calloway had not simply been a baker. In 1994, he had met a young investment banker named Philip Whitfield at a neighborhood fundraiser in Fort Greene. Philip had been 7 months into launching what would become Lumen Capital, running it out of a one-bedroom apartment with more conviction than cash. Raymond had listened to him talk for 40 minutes, asked 3 questions, and written a personal check for $75,000 the following week. That investment, quiet and undocumented in any public filing, had converted over the next decade into equity. When Raymond died, the shares passed to Desmond through a trust so carefully structured that it existed in the company's records under the name of a holding entity, Atlantic Heritage LLC. Desmond had added to it, steadily, without ceremony. Calloway & Sons had grown from a single storefront into a 6-location operation across Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. The profit margins on artisan bread in New York City are better than most people realize, and Desmond had a financial discipline that came from watching his father count every dollar with the respect of a man who remembered not having any. He reinvested those profits into additional Lumen Capital shares, purchased through the same trust, expanded through the same structure. By the time Giselle was promoted to CMO, her husband owned 28% of her company. She had not the slightest idea. Philip Whitfield, now 67, founding partner, knew. He had known for years. He and Desmond spoke on the phone every other Sunday, the way men do who share a loyalty to someone who is no longer alive but whose presence still organizes both their lives. Philip called Desmond Ray's boy and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. 2 weeks before the gala, Desmond came home early. Overcast afternoon, the kind where Brooklyn looks like a photograph someone forgot to color correct. He came in through the side door and heard Giselle's voice from the study. Low, controlled, the register she used when she was being strategic rather than conversational. The forensic accountant confirmed it. "His assets are simpler than I expected. The bakery, the house equity, whatever savings he has. The filing should be straightforward. Victor, I want this done by January." Desmond stood in the hallway, not stunned, confirmed. The difference between those two states is the difference between a wound and a scar. A wound surprises you. A scar is something you watched form. He walks back to the garage, sat in the folding chair beside his father's old workbench, and thought for a long time. Not about revenge, about clarity. That evening, he picked up his phone and texted Philip Whitfield, "I'll be at the gala Saturday. Save me a seat at the partners' table." The reply came in 4 seconds. Saved it 3 weeks ago. On Thursday, Desmond drove to Flatbush to fix a broken oven for Mrs. Josephine Laurent, a Haitian woman in her 70s who had been buying bread from his father since 1989. She tried to pay him. He refused. She tried to feed him. He accepted because refusing Josephine Laurent's rice and beans would have been a moral failing he was not prepared to carry. On Friday, he left an envelope at the community center on Nostrand Avenue. No name. Inside was a cashier's check covering 6 months of after-school program funding that the city had quietly cut from the budget in April. He did these things the way he always did them, without announcement, without expectation, without needing anyone to know. Friday night, he opened the garment bag in the back of the closet. The suit was navy, not black. Custom fitted 3 weeks ago at a shop on Smith Street. He had told no one. He hung it on the door, looked at it for a moment, and went to bed early. The Whitfield Foundation Gala was held at the Plaza Hotel on Fifth Avenue because Philip Whitfield believed that if you are going to gather 400 people in a room and ask them to care about education funding in underserved neighborhoods, you should at least make the room worth showing up to. Giselle arrived at 7:30 with Victor at her side. Midnight blue gown, hair swept up, moving through the lobby with the calibrated authority of a woman who has spent 15 years learning how to enter a room so that the room notices. Victor trailed half a step behind, close enough to imply, far enough to deny. She worked the crowd with precision, warm where warmth was strategic, funny where humor would be remembered. When a board member's wife asked where Desmond was, Giselle tilted her head with practiced grace. "Oh, you know Des? He's happiest at the bakery. I brought someone who actually speaks the language of this room." The board member's wife smiled in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. People tend to notice when someone is being diminished graciously. They simply choose in the moment not to say so. Behavioral scientists call this the bystander effect of social cruelty. We witness someone being reduced, and because the reduction is wrapped in charm, we categorize it as acceptable. We tell ourselves it wasn't that bad. But the person being reduced always knows. Desmond arrived at 8:15, alone. Navy suit, white shirt, no tie. His father's watch on his wrist, the one with the scratched crystal that he had never replaced because the scratches were part of the story. He moved through the lobby without hurrying, the way a man moves when he is not performing arrival but simply arriving. Several heads turned, not because he was loud, because he was unexpected. At her table, Giselle saw him from across the room, her champagne glass paused halfway to her mouth. Victor leaned toward her. "Is that?" "Don't," she said. Dinner was served. The seat beside Philip at the founder's table had been empty all evening. People had noticed. Philip, when asked, smiled and said nothing. At 9:15, Philip Whitfield stepped to the podium. He tapped the microphone once. The room settled with the particular obedience reserved for men who have spent 40 years earning the right to be listened to. "Good evening. Before the program, I want to make a recognition that is long overdue. In fact, it is 30 years overdue." Giselle set down her fork. Something in his tone snagged. "In 1994, a man I loved like a brother believed in me when I had nothing but a business plan and stubbornness. He invested in Lumen Capital before it had an office, before it had a name anyone recognized. He did it with a handshake and a personal check, and he never once asked for credit." Philip paused. His voice, usually meticulous, carried a thickness that surprised even him. That man was Raymond Calloway. He passed away 6 years ago, but his investment and his faith did not pass with him. He looked toward the back of the room. "I would like to invite to this stage the man who inherited that legacy and expanded it with the same quiet integrity his father lived by. The man who is, as of this month, the single largest individual shareholder of Lumen Capital, Desmond Calloway." 3 seconds of silence. Then the sound of 400 heads turning at once. Desmond rose from his chair at the back of the room and walked forward, unhurried, hands at his sides, the walk of a man who has never needed to rush because he has never been pretending to be somewhere he doesn't belong. Giselle's face underwent a transformation that 400 people witnessed and none would forget. Her hand went still on the stem of her glass. The careful architecture of her composure did not crack so much as reveal, suddenly and completely, that it had been built over nothing. Psychologists call this identity disintegration. The moment when the story a person has maintained about themselves and about the people around them becomes so violently incompatible with observable reality that the mind cannot hold both versions simultaneously, one has to collapse. It is always the fiction. Desmond reached the stage. He and Philip shook hands. The grip of two men who trust each other completely, which is among the rarest things in any room, but especially in a room full of money. Desmond stepped to the microphone. He let the silence sit for a moment, not for drama, because he was simply not in a hurry. My name is Desmond Calloway. I run a bakery on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. Most mornings, I have flour on my hands before the sun comes up. A few warm laughs, the kind that come from genuine recognition. Through my father's relationship with Philip Whitfield and through my own continued investment over the past 6 years, I have provided over $14 million in capital to Lumen Capital. As of this week, I hold 31% of the company's equity, making me its largest single shareholder. The room did not erupt. It went perfectly, completely still. I did not do this for recognition. I did it because my father believed that you build things quietly. You protect what matters, and you let the work speak for itself. He looked, briefly and without malice, toward Giselle's table. Certain recent developments have made it necessary for me to speak where I would have preferred to remain silent. I am sharing this now because transparency, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only foundation worth standing on. He stepped back. The applause began slowly. Then, it built. The kind of applause that comes from people who have just understood something they had previously been too polite or too distracted to see. At her table, Giselle sat perfectly still while the world she had constructed rearranged itself around a truth she had never thought to look for. Victor leaned close. "Did you know about this?" She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Philip returned to the podium. His expression had shifted. Warmer a moment ago, now precise. "I have one additional matter. This one is less pleasant, but the board has determined it must be addressed publicly." The projection screen behind him lit up. A financial document. Dense. Tabular. 3 rows highlighted in red. Over the past 14 months, Lumen Capital has experienced significant irregularities in client billing routed through a marketing operations account overseen by a single individual. The forensic audit completed last week traced $1.9 million in fraudulent charges to inflated vendor contracts, fabricated consulting fees, and falsified expense reports. He looked up. Victor Ashford. The name landed like a hammer on glass. Victor's face moved through several stages: surprise, calculation, denial, and then something that was trying very hard to look like composure, but was clearly just paralysis. His hand on the wine glass trembled visibly. Giselle turned to look at him. This was a different expression from the one she had worn a moment before. That had been the shock of a collapsing story. This was colder. The recognition of a woman who has just understood that the man she chose over her husband had not chosen her at all. He had chosen her access. This is precisely what personality researchers describe as covert narcissism in action. Charm as a tool, intimacy as a means of access, the performance of loyalty as a method of extraction. Victor had not attached himself to Giselle because she was exceptional. He had attached himself because she was the CMO of a company with marketing budgets he could manipulate. The board has referred its findings to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Philip said. Mr. Ashford will address these matters through the appropriate legal channels. He paused, but that is not all. In the third row of tables, near the east wall, sat a woman in her mid-70s. Small, dignified, wearing a dress that was clean and pressed, but clearly not new. Her hands are folded in her lap with the particular care of someone who has spent a lifetime holding herself together in rooms that were not designed for her comfort. Her name was Alma Thornton, Giselle's grandmother, the woman who had cleaned offices in Midtown for 31 years so that her granddaughter could go to college. The woman who, 19 months ago, had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's and whose long-term care costs had exceeded her Medicare coverage by a margin that made the numbers feel like a wall. Giselle had told colleagues her grandmother was managing. She had told herself the same thing, because admitting the gap between the life she projected and the life she was navigating would have required a vulnerability she had spent her entire career learning to suppress. She had not known what her husband had done. Desmond returned to the microphone. He spoke without performance. 18 months ago, through an anonymous care fund established at New York Presbyterian, I arranged full coverage for the long-term treatment of a patient with early-stage Alzheimer's. The fund covered specialized care, in-home nursing support, medical consultations, and family transportation throughout treatment. He paused. That patient is Alma Thornton, my wife's grandmother. Complete silence. The kind that presses against your chest. I did not tell anyone. I am sharing it now because the full truth is the only thing worth building on. Not to cause pain, but because the people in this room deserve to know who has been holding what, and for how long, and at what cost. He looked at Giselle. Her hands were in her lap, shaking, visible from 30 feet away. Psychologist Jonathan Hyde describes what happened next in the room as moral elevation, the emotional response triggered by witnessing genuine virtue that has been hidden and unrewarded, a tightness in the chest, a warmth behind the eyes. It is one of the most specifically human experiences documented in effective science, and every person at those tables felt some version of it. From the third row, Alma Thornton stood up, slowly, with the careful deliberation of a woman whose body does not move the way it once did. People stepped back without being asked. She walked between the tables, past the silent waitstaff, past the projection screen still displaying the fraud figures, and she walked to the stage. Desmond came down the steps to meet her. She put her arms around him. The microphone was still on. "My boy," she said. Her voice carried through the entire room. "My sweet, sweet boy. I never doubted you. Not for 1 second." He held her. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have improved upon silence. At a table near the center, a managing partner known for never displaying emotion was studying the centerpiece with extraordinary concentration. His wife had given up pretending and was openly crying. Giselle was weeping, not the composed kind, both hands pressed against her face, shoulders moving, mascara gone. The gown, the posture, the performance, all of it dissolved in the specific gravity of a truth she had spent years refusing to see. Beside her, Victor Ashford, $1.9 million in fraud charges accumulating against his name, had nothing to offer. The protégé, the upgrade, the man who understood the room, publicly, thoroughly, quietly destroyed. Later, near the coat check, Victor attempted an explanation. "It was a temporary arrangement. I was going to restructure the accounts." A partner cut him off. "You were billing phantom consultants to a shell company in Delaware while leasing a Tribeca loft you told people you owned. What restructuring?" Victor had no answer. Desmond found Giselle near the elevator bank. She had rebuilt her composure through sheer force of habit, eyes hollow underneath it. She saw him coming and straightened. An old reflex. He stopped in front of her, not angry, not forgiving, simply present in the way that only a person who has nothing left to prove can be. "You told me I was embarrassing," he said quietly. "You said I didn't belong in that room. You said Victor spoke the language of your world." He looked at her steadily. "Ask yourself what language Victor was actually speaking, and then ask yourself what language I have been speaking for 11 years while you weren't listening." He collected his coat, kissed Zara, who had been watching from a chair near the hallway with the quiet, knowing expression of a 14-year-old who understands more than anyone has given her credit for. And he walked out into the September night. Consequences do not arrive all at once. They come the way autumn comes to New York. A slow turning, a gradual stripping of leaves until the branches are bare and you can finally see the shape of what was always underneath. Victor Ashford was terminated by formal letter the following Monday. His attorney negotiated cooperation with the federal investigation, which Victor provided with the frantic over-explaining of a man who has just discovered that performance does not function as a legal defense. By November, he was facing wire fraud charges and living in a studio apartment in Jersey City. The Tribeca loft, it turned out, had been subleased under a corporate account that no longer existed. The entire structure of his life had been a set built on a soundstage, and someone had just turned on the house lights. This is what researchers mean by the distinction between constructed identity and earned identity. A constructed identity is assembled from external signals, the address, the title, the vocabulary of success. Remove the signals and there is nothing underneath to hold the shape. Victor had been living entirely inside a construction. And Giselle, whose own identity was built on the scaffolding of achievement and the desperate need to never be powerless again, had looked at that construction and mistaken it for substance. Fear makes that mistake easy. When you are running from something, you run toward whatever looks least like what you left behind. Lumen Capital was struggling. The fraud had damaged client confidence. Two major institutional investors pulled back. By December, the CFO's internal memo used the words reputational exposure and immediate capital intervention in the same paragraph. Giselle received her copy on a Tuesday morning and read it twice. She knew what the company needed. She knew who had it. The divorce had been filed in October. Desmond had not contested the brownstone. He moved without ceremony to a walk-up apartment on Dean Street in Borum Hill. 2 bedrooms, high ceilings, a kitchen big enough to bake in. It suited him better than the brownstone ever had. Zara stayed with him on weekends and most weekday evenings by her own choice, a fact that said more than any custody agreement could. The emergency board meeting was held in January. 14 people, 1 agenda item. Desmond arrived alone. Same navy suit. Same quiet. He placed a document on the table, structured, specific, covering the shortfall and providing runway for restructuring, enough to save the company, enough to protect the 312 employees who had been entirely peripheral to every decision that brought them to this room. One condition. Giselle read it in the second paragraph and understood it before she finished the sentence. As a condition of this funding, the current chief marketing officer will voluntarily resign. The resignation will be announced in a full meeting of the board and company staff. There is a meaningful difference between punishment and consequence. Punishment is personal. It satisfies the one delivering it. Consequence is structural. It restores what was broken in the system, not just in the individual. Desmond was not trying to humiliate Giselle. He was requiring that a woman, who had publicly claimed credit for the company's success, accept public accountability for the failure she had allowed inside its walls. That is not cruelty. That is a standard held consistently. Giselle picked up the pen. She signed. The announcement was made 3 days later in the main conference hall. Full company attendance. Desmond sat in the last row. Giselle stood at the front in a gray blazer. No gown, no armor. She read her prepared statement with a voice that held steady through what was clearly costing her everything. When she finished, the room offered the complicated, quiet applause of people who have witnessed something that required courage, even compelled courage. Desmond did not applaud. He sat with his hands in his lap and watched her with the expression of a man who takes no satisfaction in another person's fall, even a deserved one. Psychologists call this equanimity. Neither vindictive nor passive, simply clear. It is one of the most difficult emotional states to sustain because most people, when wronged, want either revenge or reconciliation. Equanimity asks for neither. It asks only that things be true. In the weeks that followed, certain invitations stopped arriving at Giselle's address. Certain conversations shifted temperature when she entered a room. The network she had spent 15 years building turned out to have been attached primarily to her title rather than her person, a discovery that most people who confuse the two eventually make, though rarely all at once. One afternoon in March, she drove to Atlantic Avenue, parked outside Callaway & Sons, sat in the car for a long time, watching through the window as Desmond moved behind the counter, handing a fresh loaf to a regular, laughing at something she could not hear. She went inside. The bell above the door rang the way it had rung every morning for 37 years. Desmond looked up. She did not make a speech. She stood in the middle of the bakery, in her coat, surrounded by the smell of bread and cinnamon and the quiet hum of a place that had been built by hands that never needed an audience. "I was wrong," she said, "about everything that mattered. Desmond wiped his hands on the towel behind the counter. Slowly, with the patient deliberateness of a man who has never rushed anything important. He looked at her for a long time. "You told me I didn't belong in that room," he said. Not with anger, with something closer to simple observation. "Look where you're standing right now. Look where you came to find the only honest thing left." She had no answer. There was not one available. He handed her a coffee, not as forgiveness, as a practical gesture from a man who is decent even when he has no obligation to be. Then he turned back to the dough and continued working. 1 year later, September had come back around to Brooklyn the way it always does, warm and golden and slightly melancholy, the light slanting through the brownstones on Atlantic Avenue at an angle that makes the whole street look like something someone is about to remember. Desmond Calloway was standing in the open kitchen of Calloway & Sons, flour on his hands, teaching a 17-year-old named Isaiah how to shape a proper boule. Isaiah was quick-minded and impatient in the specific way of smart young people who have not yet learned that patience is itself a form of skill. "You're not just shaping bread," Desmond told him. "You're learning to pay attention to what something needs instead of what you want it to be. That's a skill that goes everywhere." Isaiah looked skeptical. "That sounds like something off a poster in a guidance counselor's office." "Maybe," Desmond said. "But guidance counselors aren't usually covered in flour at 5 in the morning. Context matters." Isaiah considered this. Okay, that was a little better. The Callaway Community Kitchen had opened in April 2 doors down from the original bakery in a space Desmond had purchased and renovated over the winter. The renovation had taken longer than planned and cost more than the estimate, which is the fate of every renovation in the history of real estate. And Desmond had absorbed both facts with the equanimity of a man who understands that good things are rarely efficient. The program's premise was specific. Practical skill and personal development are not separate categories. Knowing how to make something with your hands does not preclude knowing how to build a life. Morning sessions covered baking, kitchen management, food safety, and nutrition. Afternoons were financial literacy, resume building, and communication. Friday afternoons, Philip Whitfield came in and talked to the students about business, not the textbook version, but the real one, with all its friction and moral ambiguity intact. Philip was, without question, the students' favorite instructor. He found this gratifying and mildly alarming. 28 students in the first cohort. The waiting list for the second was 61 names long and growing. Desmond taught the Tuesday morning session himself. He intended to keep doing so for as long as it mattered, which he suspected would be a very long time. He wanted the students to see that the man who funded the program and owned the building was the same man who showed up before dawn and got his hands in the dough, that the distance between where they stood and where they were going was real but crossable, that the most important thing you could do on any given Tuesday morning was show up and do the work. His father had lived this way. Desmond intended to pass it forward the same way he had received it, not through speeches, but through presence. Researchers who study post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon of individuals emerging from significant adversity with greater resilience, clarity, and sense of purpose than they possessed before, consistently identify several conditions that make it possible: a strong pre-existing sense of self, a support network built on genuine trust, and the ability to find meaning in what happened without minimizing or dramatizing it. Desmond had all three. He had his father's legacy. He had Philip. He had the bakery, the students, the Tuesday mornings. And then, quietly and without announcement, he had Naomi. Dr. Naomi Okafor was a food scientist at Columbia, 36, precise in the way of people who work with measurements, with a warmth that arrived in small, specific gestures rather than grand declarations. She had read about the Callaway Community Kitchen in a neighborhood newsletter and come by one afternoon to see whether her expertise in nutrition science might be useful. Desmond had been elbow-deep in sourdough when she arrived. He looked up, flour across his forehead, and she regarded him with the direct, assessing gaze of a scientist examining a system. "Your fermentation schedule is outdated," she said. "The research on long-proof methods has moved significantly in the last 2 years. You're underproofing by about 11%. He blinked. "You want to correct my bread?" I want it to be optimal, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He smiled. The real kind, the kind that starts in the eyes and takes its time reaching the mouth. Come back Thursday. She came back Thursday. And the following Thursday, and by December they had revised every recipe in the curriculum and also shared 4 dinners at a Senegalese restaurant on Fulton Street, where the tea boudin was extraordinary and the conversations ran longer than either of them had intended. She never asked about the gala. She had heard about it the way you hear things in New York, in fragments, through networks, through the ambient hum of a city that processes other people's revelations as Tuesday morning gossip. But she did not bring it up because it was not relevant to who Desmond was. It was relevant to what he had survived. Those are different categories, and she understood the difference. What she saw instead was the man who arrived at the bakery before his staff every morning, the man who called Mrs. Laurent on the first of every month to check whether she needed anything and never thought of it as charity, just as obvious. The man who, when she asked what he was most proud of, sat quietly for a moment and said, "When one of my students opens their own place someday, that's what I'm building toward." She had set down her fork and looked at him. "You're a remarkable person. I hope you know that." "Not particularly," he said. "That," she said, "is exactly what I mean. Authentic humility, not the performed kind, but the genuine absence of the need to be recognized as exceptional, is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term psychological well-being. People whose sense of self does not depend on external validation are measurably and consistently more settled in themselves, not because their lives are easier, but because their peace is not contingent on anyone else's opinion. Desmond Calloway had never needed to be seen as remarkable. He had needed to build something real, care for people genuinely, and come home at the end of the day with clean hands. Metaphorically speaking, since the flower was generally a permanent condition, that was enough. It had always been enough. Giselle was rebuilding. Slowly, painfully, honestly. She had begun working with a therapist in Midtown, which she had resisted for years on the grounds that she did not need help. A reason therapists here with remarkable frequency. She was learning, at significant personal cost, the difference between ambition and survival instinct, between building a life and fleeing a fear, between the appearance of strength and the daily, unglamorous practice of it. Whether she would fully arrive at the other side of that work was a story still being written. But she was, for the first time, writing it with her eyes open. Alma Thornton called Desmond every Sunday. She called him my boy every time and meant it more with each passing week. He always answered. He always had time. On a September afternoon in Borum Hill, Desmond Calloway sat on the fire escape of the Dean Street apartment, Naomi beside him, a cup of coffee going pleasantly cool on the railing. Zara inside doing homework with music playing softly through the open window. The maple tree on the street below had just begun to turn. It was ordinary, deeply, quietly ordinary. The particular kind of ordinary that you only recognize as extraordinary when you have spent enough time without it. He thought about his father, about the letter in the drawer, about what it means to build something that outlasts you, not the building itself but the intention behind it. The decision to put your hands to something real and stay with it when it is hard and keep going when nobody is watching. That decision, made quietly, made consistently, made over years, is not dramatic. It does not make for good headlines. But it is, in the end, the only kind of building that holds. He set down his coffee. He was, he realized, genuinely happy. Not the relieved kind, not the triumphant kind, the actual kind, the quiet, solid, built from the ground up kind, the quiet, solid, built from the ground up kind that does not require an audience. This story leaves behind a single practical truth. The people in your life who go quiet, who show up before dawn, who give without presenting the receipt, who hold things together in ways you never thought to check. Look at those people again. Look carefully, because the ones who make the least noise are very often carrying the most weight. And if you are the one who has been quiet, if you have been building something real while someone nearby decided you were background, do not change, do not perform, do not shrink. Keep your hands on the work. The foundation you are laying will outlast every opinion anyone ever held about you. The truth does not need your help. It only needs your patience. Before you go, tell me honestly in the comments. Was Desmond right to save the company that his wife used against him? Or did his kindness go further than fairness required?